the significance of this day and the event is that we are in a moment in history where Africa has to make some very hard choices about the future, and particularly the future of development. You know, we've been invaded and colonized since recorded history. The Greeks, Romans, Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, Italian, British, Germans, the Belgians, they've all come here and had a go at plundering the resources, including taking slaves from this continent, mainly to America, obviously, and to the Americas. But I think we've all known and learned about the brave liberation struggles that have been fought throughout the continent. And when we reached the moment of final political liberation, which was the end of apartheid in South Africa, we realized that when one looks at the continent, there may be political freedom in most of the countries in the sense that people can choose their own governments. But whether that means that they have sovereignty is another matter altogether, because we've seen the re-emergence of colonialism in a new form. We've branded that as a neo-colonialism. And this has meant that while there have been changes in political leadership, different political parties in power, there's no substantive change in terms of the political economy in all African countries. And I would argue that very few have any kind of sovereignty at all. And of course, this has meant an absolute disaster for the people of Africa. Colonialism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism have haunted us and have destroyed, entire civilizations and meant absolute poverty and misery for the majority of Africans. The Cold War era was very interesting because that brought a new dynamic with the creation of the non-aligned movement. And it was arguably a period of relative autonomy for many countries on the continent. During this period, many African countries had strong relationships with Russia and China, and to some extent with India. And even if trade and investment levels between those countries and the African continent were low by comparison that we see with the West, it did mean that people could make choices for their own countries. I think the post-Cold War period has seen a more fluid, contradictory, and often even confused relationship between the former colonized and the former colonizers. Neoliberal policies, coup d'etats, regime change, and the continued underdevelopment of the continent have meant that wherever change has been possible, it has most often been undermined by the former colonists and the imperialists. And this almost always with the collaboration of some African elites. What really began to change things was the economic transformation of China, because it grew into a giant, and to a less extent Russia and India as economic powers. And that has brought a real new dynamic where trade and investment by China, India and Russia has really started to shift the balance of power in the continent and between the former colonizers and the colonized. And this presents, I believe, an opportunity for more balanced and more sustainable development on the African continent. And that's not to say that these relationships don't have their own contradictions, but whatever those contradictions, they are absolutely, infinitesimally small when compared to what the effect of neo-colonialism on the continent. I think the last decade has also seen something interesting, because as America in particular, but the West in general, have woken up to the fact that China is such a huge power, they've started to redefine their relationships to the former colonized and in the various African countries in an attempt to gain a bigger foothold that enables them to dictate policy and control trade and investment in the continent, and most importantly, to control the many resources that we have. I think it's important for us to then define the strategy of what countries like Russia, China, and India are doing in comparison. And I believe that their emphasis is on trying to to develop what I would call far more fair and sustainable relationships of trade and investment with African countries. So while the neo-colonial strategy seems almost to want to impose the same relationship that they had under colonialism, the alternative, which, as I say, is led mainly by China, but these days more of Russia and even India to some extent, means that it creates a space for us and an opportunity to redefine the way in which development takes place on the continent. You know, we all know that neocolonialism really is about stripping our resources, super exploitation of local labor, and controlling policies so that countries are not able to become independent from the powers, you know, that exercise these. So I think the key issue for us then is that we must recognize that we have to try to develop this new relationship, but we're going to have to do it on a perilous terrain. The rise of China and Russia's new interest in forging these relationships with Africa, not to mention trade from the Middle East, countries like Iran, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who are all coming here and offering investment into the continent and looking to trade. They do so against the counter strategy of the former colonizers and the imperialists. And I mean, we've seen regime change in Libya, Egypt, various other countries on the continent. And I believe, you know, if one even looks at France flexing its muscles in its former colonies, as much as that's being resisted by us, there's a coordinated approach, and we have to be aware of that so that we can respond to it in a far more potent way. So I think it's a very dangerous climate. You know, if you look at the numbers, America has 20 military bases on the African continent. By comparison, China has 1. France has 4. Other countries like Turkey, Japan, and them all have 1 each. But it's absolutely clear who the policeman is on this continent. It's the United States of America. And I think that apart from the regime change programs of the USA that we've already seen, you know, it's not since the 1960s really where we've seen such direct intervention, you know, with the assassinations of Lumumba and Sankara, Tongogara and other leaders. And I would even argue Chris Hani in the South African case. But it's quite clear that there's a clear agenda to influence us. And if we don't toe the line, if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, if we don't support the Western line, then basically we're given a tongue lashing and a finger wagging. But I think what it means is that we must prepare ourselves for interference in our politics and attempts to even limit our sovereignty from what it is today. You know, even the UK has begun to play a different role. You know, they dress it up with things like this just transition to renewables and so on. But there's a regime change agenda. And I think in the South African case, as we've seen in others, it may not be necessarily to intervene militarily, but in our case, it would be, for example, to reduce the ANC to under 50% of the vote, as we've seen at local government level, so that they can then begin to dictate policy. So I think it means that the challenge we face as socialists, communists, and progressive people generally is that given this renewed focus on Africa as a theater of contestation, we have to begin to position ourselves for greater regional and African unity. In other words, we've got to build or rebuild a pan-African agenda. And I would argue that we have to make that a socialist agenda, because an agenda that just seeks to ensure that we have liberal democracy won't address the economic and development challenges that we have on the continent. And what does that mean? That means promoting working class unity and certainly trade union unity and cooperation. All of those liberation movements that we've seen throughout the continent, and even in the South African case, are in trouble. Political parties that have been in power who were once left, these days, I think one can hardly call them that. So we've really got to work to create the political alternative And in some cases, that may mean working with existing liberation movements, but in others, it means we have to start from scratch. And then we have to define a regional, a continental, a south, and even a global response to what we've seen. For us as activists, that also means that we've got to stop being spectators. I think to a large extent, if we are honest with ourselves, we've stood by and watched all of these things happening on the continent and done very little about it. You know, when Libya was challenged, there was a little bit of an outcry, but people gave a confused response, arguing, you know, that Gaddafi was a dictator. Well, Gaddafi may not have been the most democratic person, but certainly what has replaced him is far worse for the Libyan people. And I would argue that that's going to be the same for the rest of us throughout the continent. So we must fight for democracy and fight for space within the countries. But we must also understand that we have two fronts that we have to fight on. The one is against this imperialism and neo-colonialism, and the other is internally for democracy. And we can only do that if we have a clear agenda and then we unite as activists. So for me, I'd like us to use this Africa Day to recommit to the vision that was presented to us by great leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and others for a real African Renaissance, not the bourgeois one, the one where we transform the relationships between people and ensure that we build socialism on this continent. Thank you very much.